Right now, the United States is fighting a war with Iran. Missiles flying, ships escorting oil tankers, generals giving confident interviews, politicians arguing on television. In other words, Washington is busy. Very busy. And President Donald Trump is focused on Iran. But recently, he said something interesting. The United States is talking to Cuba, but we're going to do Iran before Cuba. Before Cuba. Which is a strange sentence, because most presidents usually try not to sound like they have a waiting list of countries. So while the Pentagon is staring very hard at the Persian Gulf, some analysts are asking a different question. What if the next crisis is not in the Middle East? What if it's 90 miles from Florida? What if the next headline is simply Cuba? Cuba today is a strange place. It feels like a museum. Old Soviet cars, old Soviet buildings, and sometimes old Soviet electricity, which means it works, occasionally. The Cuban government has survived for decades, through sanctions, through isolation, through economic disasters. It even survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is impressive. But today the situation is getting worse. One of its comrades, Russia, is busy fighting a war. Another ally, Maduro, is now sitting in an American courtroom. Power outages, food shortages, and an economy that looks like it is held together with duct tape and optimism. And optimism is currently in short supply. So, why Washington still watches Cuba? From a military perspective, Cuba is not a superpower. It does not have aircraft carriers, it does not have stealth bombers, and it definitely does not have a Pentagon budget. But Cuba has something else: location. Cuba sits right in the Caribbean, right next to the United States. Close enough that if you stand on the beach in Florida, you can almost hear Havana saying, "We're still here." For Washington, that location has always been uncomfortable, because, historically, great powers do not like rival ideologies sitting in their backyard. This story actually begins many decades ago. Back in 1962, when the Soviet Union decided to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, and suddenly the world discovered something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world held its breath, because two superpowers were basically arguing with nuclear weapons. Eventually, the crisis ended. The missiles were removed, and humanity collectively agreed that maybe starting nuclear wars was a bad idea. Since then, Cuba has remained a symbol of defiance, and occasionally a symbol of very long political grudges. Now, fast forward to today. The United States is currently dealing with Iran, missile attacks, regional tensions, oil routes that suddenly look very dangerous. Wars like this are complicated. They involve allies, proxies, naval patrols, and thousands of analysts explaining on television that everything is under control, which usually means nobody is sure what happens next. And this raises an interesting strategic question. Can a country fight one major conflict and start another one at the same time? Military history has a very clear answer. Two-front wars are dangerous. Germany learned that lesson in World War I, and then, just to be absolutely certain, they learned it again in World War II. Even the most powerful countries prefer to focus on one crisis at a time. Wars are expensive. They require ships, planes, logistics, and perhaps most importantly, political patience. And political patience is a rare resource. Now, let's be clear about something. If the United States ever decided to attack Cuba militarily, the outcome would not be a mystery. The U.S. military is the most powerful military on Earth. Cuba's armed forces are small, and mostly equipped with older Soviet systems. In pure military terms, this would not be a long fight. But war is not just about winning battles. It is about what happens afterward. And that part is always more complicated. Imagine the situation. An American invasion of Cuba. Immediately, several things happen. First, Latin America gets very nervous. Second, millions of Cuban civilians might try to leave the island. And guess where they would go? Florida. Suddenly the Caribbean becomes the world's busiest refugee route, and Washington would discover that military victories can create very large political headaches. Which is why most experts believe the United States would not need to invade Cuba. There are other tools: sanctions, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and occasionally, very serious conversations behind closed doors. The goal is simple: not immediate collapse, but gradual pressure. Pressure that slowly weakens a system from the inside. In geopolitics, this approach has a name: patience. Of course, this story is not just about Cuba and the United States. Other countries are watching too. China, Russia. Because every geopolitical situation is also a chessboard. If Cuba changes politically, the balance of influence in the Caribbean changes too, which means this small island still matters far more than its size suggests. Geography can be very unfair that way. So, will the United States strike Cuba next? The honest answer is probably not while the Iran war is still unfolding. Opening a second major confrontation would be risky, even for a superpower. But pressure? Pressure can happen anytime. Economic pressure, political pressure, strategic pressure. Those things do not require aircraft carriers, only patience. And Washington has been patient about Cuba for a very long time. So while the world is watching the war in Iran, somewhere in Havana, someone in the government might still be thinking, "Good, they're distracted." But geopolitics has a funny rule. Superpowers rarely forget unfinished business. And Cuba has been on Washington's to-do list for more than 60 years. The question is not whether the United States can act. The real question is simply this: when?
Thank you for watching PastCast, where the past echoes through today. If you enjoyed the satire, scrolls, and scandals, like, subscribe, and ring the bell before the next empire falls.